Sometimes the smallest piece of paper tells the biggest lie, the old bus driver would say whenever he saw someone staring too long at a paycheck. But on that cold Thursday night, the two wrinkled pay stubs resting in Maya Brooks' exhausted hand were not lying at all. They were simply telling a truth no one important had ever bothered to read. The city bus lurched away from the curb just after 11:40 p.m., its tired engine humming beneath flickering fluorescent lights as rain streaked across the windows in silver lines. Maya barely noticed. Her head had already fallen sideways against the glass before the doors even finished closing. The paper coffee cup balanced between her boots tipped over, rolling gently across the rubber floor until it bumped against the wheelchair ramp. She never woke up. Her fingers remained tightly wrapped around the two folded pay stubs, as though letting go of them might somehow erase the 16 hours she had just worked. A few rows behind her, a man wearing a dark hoodie and a faded baseball cap glanced up from the notebook resting on his knee. He had boarded without security, without assistance, without anyone recognizing the face that appeared on magazine covers every other month. Elias Carter preferred buses on nights when board meetings left him unable to think. Numbers always looked cleaner on spreadsheets than they did inside his own head. He had spent the last 4 hours defending another quarter of record profits while investors applauded every percentage point. Now the applause still echoed in his ears, somehow louder than the bus engine. The driver braked suddenly. Maya slipped sideways. The pay stubs slid from her loose grip and floated onto the aisle. Elias stood almost automatically, catching them before another passenger stepped across them. He intended to hand them back without looking. That was the decent thing to do. Then one folded corner opened by accident. His eyes caught a familiar company logo. Carter Freight Distribution. His company. He frowned. The second stub carried another logo he recognized immediately. Meridian Facility Services. One of Carter Logistics' largest subcontractors. He looked again, this time because something no longer made sense. 81 hours. 35 hours. 2 employers. 1 week. Federal withholding. State withholding. Health deductions. Net pay. He silently added the numbers twice because the first answer seemed impossible. The total wouldn't even cover the average monthly rent in the neighborhood where the warehouse stood. Not after taxes. Not after childcare. Not after groceries. Not after gasoline. His jaw tightened. He checked the dates again. Different employers. Same week. Different payroll processors. Same corporate supply chain. The woman sleeping 3 rows ahead wasn't working 2 unrelated jobs. She was working inside 2 different companies that ultimately fed the same billion-dollar business empire. His business empire. The bus rolled beneath another streetlight, washing pale gold across Maya's face. Dark circles rested beneath closed eyes that looked far older than 32. Her work shoes had begun separating from their soles. A tiny dinosaur backpack sat beside her, one zipper repaired with blue yarn instead of metal. A child's math worksheet peeked from the front pocket. Someone had written in careful pencil, Noah Brooks. Grade 2. Across the page, every answer had earned a bright red check mark except the last one, where a teacher had written, almost there. Try again tomorrow. Elias swallowed. Tomorrow. He glanced toward the digital route display. This bus wouldn't reach Maya's stop for another 22 minutes. She had likely boarded after finishing one shift only to wake before sunrise for the next. The realization settled slowly, heavier than the pay stubs themselves. His board had celebrated productivity that afternoon. Somewhere inside those congratulatory slides were charts praising labor efficiency, scheduling optimization, and reduced operating costs. No chart had mentioned sleeping mothers. No graph had measured exhaustion. No quarterly report had counted second-grade homework finished under fluorescent breakroom lights. The bus hissed to another stop. Several passengers stepped off without speaking. Rain drifted inside before the doors closed again. Maya didn't move. She slept with the complete surrender of someone whose body had quietly decided it could no longer negotiate with fatigue. Elias carefully refolded the pay stubs exactly the way he had found them. For one brief second, he considered placing them back into her hand and walking away at his own stop. It would have been easier, cleaner. The life he understood would remain untouched. Instead, he looked once more at the payroll codes printed across the bottom of the page. A tiny contractor identification number sat beneath the barcode. He recognized it instantly because he had approved the acquisition himself 3 years earlier. Something inside him turned cold. He had boarded the last bus hoping to escape work for one quiet ride across the city. Instead, work had followed him into the only place his reports never had. And before the night was over, he was about to discover that Maya Brooks was not the exception. She was the first person whose name he had finally learned. The bus sighed to a stop beneath a flickering street lamp, and the driver glanced into the mirror before calling gently, "Maple and 17th. Last stop on this route." Maya opened her eyes with a sharp breath, confusion flashing across her face before exhaustion settled back in. She immediately looked down at her empty hand. Panic replaced sleep in an instant. She searched the seat, the floor, her worn canvas bag. "My pay stubs," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Elias stepped forward from the aisle and held out the folded papers. "I think these slipped while the bus stopped." Relief softened her shoulders. She accepted them with both hands as though he had returned something priceless. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I cannot replace these." He nodded without revealing that he had already memorized every number printed across them. "Long day?" he asked. Maya managed a tired smile that disappeared almost immediately. "Long week." The doors opened with a hiss. Cold air drifted inside, carrying the smell of wet pavement. Maya adjusted the small dinosaur backpack over one shoulder and stepped onto the sidewalk. Elias hesitated only a moment before following. He had planned to call a car from downtown, but instead he found himself walking several yards behind her without fully understanding why. The neighborhood looked different from the boardroom presentations that described it as an emerging logistics corridor. Storefronts were dark. A laundromat buzzed beneath fading neon. A pharmacy window displayed a handwritten sign announcing reduced hours because they could not keep enough staff. Maya crossed 2 blocks before stopping outside a narrow brick building with peeling paint around the entrance. She reached into her pocket, counted a handful of coins, frowned, then pushed open the lobby door. Elias remained across the street beside a closed diner. Through the cloudy glass, he saw an elderly woman waiting near the mailboxes with a little boy wrapped in an oversized hoodie. The child spotted Maya first. "Mom!" Noah ran into her arms before she could even kneel. She hugged him tightly, closing her eyes for one brief second as though borrowing strength from the embrace. "Did you finish your math?" she asked. Noah nodded proudly. "Miss Alvarez said I only missed one." Maya smiled. "That means tomorrow you will get them all." The elderly woman handed Maya a lunch container. "He saved you some macaroni," she said. "You missed dinner again." Maya thanked her with quiet sincerity that suggested this exchange had happened many times before. She disappeared upstairs with Noah, leaving the hallway lights to flicker behind them. Elias stood motionless. He had expected hardship. He had not expected dignity so carefully preserved inside it. His phone vibrated. The screen displayed the name of his chief financial officer, Graham Whitmore. He ignored the call. It rang again almost immediately. This time a text appeared. "Investors loved today's presentation. Congratulations. Best quarter in company history." Elias looked back toward the apartment windows where one small kitchen light turned on. Through the thin curtains, he could barely make out Maya, setting 2 plates on a tiny table while Noah animatedly described something with his hands. She listened despite the exhaustion written across every movement. She laughed once. The sound did not reach the sidewalk, but somehow he knew it was there. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Graham. "Tomorrow we begin Phase 2 of the Workforce Efficiency Plan." Elias stared at the words longer than necessary. Workforce efficiency. Hours earlier, he would have approved the next round without hesitation. Now those words carried Maya's face instead of percentages. They carried worn shoes, a repaired backpack, and 2 pay stubs that somehow represented more than one person's struggle. Across the street, a delivery van pulled beside the building. A young driver climbed out carrying grocery bags. He handed them to another tenant before saying, "Double shift again tomorrow?" The man laughed without humor. "Unless somebody invents a 25th hour." The driver shrugged as though that answer made perfect sense. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. This neighborhood spoke a language his company reports had never translated. People were not choosing overtime because they wanted larger savings accounts. They were stitching together survival one shift at a time. As midnight approached, rain began falling again, tapping softly against parked cars. Elias finally turned toward his own waiting driver, who had been circling the block after repeated unanswered calls. Before climbing inside, he looked once more at the apartment window. Noah had fallen asleep at the kitchen table with his math worksheet still open. Maya carefully lifted him into her arms. Even after 16 hours of work, she carried him upstairs with the same patience she had used when thanking a stranger for returning 2 ordinary pieces of paper. Elias closed the car door without saying a word, but one decision had already been made before the engine even started. Tomorrow he would not begin with another executive meeting. Tomorrow he was going to find out exactly how a company celebrated record profits while mothers like Maya Brooks still had to choose between sleep and survival. By 7:15 the next morning, the polished glass walls of Carter Logistics reflected a sunrise that looked almost too perfect to belong to the same city Maya Brooks had crossed before dawn. Elias stood alone in the executive conference room while the skyline slowly brightened behind him. On the table sat 2 objects that had never appeared together before: a leather portfolio containing next year's expansion plans and 2 wrinkled pay stubs he had smoothed flat with his own hands. Graham Whitmore entered carrying a tablet and his usual confidence. "The board wants to congratulate you before we begin. The efficiency initiative exceeded every projection." Elias did not answer immediately. Instead, he slid one of the pay stubs across the table. Graham glanced down for less than 2 seconds before pushing it back. "Whose payroll is that?" "One of ours," Elias replied. "Technically subcontracted," Graham corrected without looking again. "Not technically," Elias said quietly. "Operationally." Graham sighed. "If this is about contractors again, we have been through the legal review. Every vendor complies with state and federal regulations." Elias looked out the window. The city appeared peaceful from 60 floors above the street. Tiny buses moved like toys through morning traffic. Somewhere inside one of them, Maya was probably beginning another shift. "Legal is not the same as right," he said. Graham smiled politely, the way executives often did before explaining something they believed was obvious. "Our responsibility is to shareholders. Vendors determine wages. We negotiate contracts. That separation exists for a reason." Elias finally turned toward him. "Do you know how many hours someone has to work before exhaustion becomes normal?" Graham frowned. "I do not see how that relates to today's agenda." "Neither did I," Elias admitted. The meeting was interrupted as department leaders filled the room carrying laptops, coffee, and printed reports. Screens lit up with charts climbing steadily upward in shades of blue and green. Revenue, productivity, labor optimization, customer satisfaction. Every graph pointed confidently in the right direction. Elias watched the presentation begin exactly as it had dozens of times before. Vice presidents celebrated improved staffing ratios. Supply chain managers praised scheduling algorithms. Human resources highlighted lower turnover among direct employees. No slide mentioned subcontractors. No chart measured second jobs. No one asked whether a full-time paycheck could support a family. The omissions suddenly felt louder than every statistic projected across the wall. Halfway through the presentation, Elias interrupted for the first time in years. "Show me compensation across every contractor connected to our distribution network." Silence settled over the room. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. Graham answered first. "That information is outside today's scope." "Then expand the scope." "It would take weeks." "Start now." Graham folded his hands. "Respectfully, that data does not exist in one place." Elias stared at him. "You are telling me we manage millions of shipments every month, but we cannot tell whether the people moving them can afford rent." No one responded. The room suddenly felt smaller. Graham finally cleared his throat. "With respect, individual financial situations vary. We cannot build policy around isolated anecdotes." Isolated. The word lingered in the air. Elias reached into his jacket and placed Noah's math worksheet beside the pay stubs. The paper still carried the teacher's handwritten note. "Almost there. Try again tomorrow." "Yesterday, I thought this belonged to one family," Elias said. "This morning, I am beginning to wonder whether it belongs to thousands." Graham's expression remained controlled, but his voice hardened slightly. "If you chase every emotional story, you will stop running a company and start running a charity." Elias did not argue. Instead, he quietly closed the presentation on the large screen. The room filled with surprised murmurs. "Cancel the remaining agenda," he said. "I want every contractor agreement, every wage schedule, every scheduling policy, every attendance incentive and every productivity bonus on my desk by tomorrow morning. Graham leaned forward. That will delay the investor rollout. Then delay it. The board will object. Elias met his eyes without raising his voice. Then they can object after they explain why no one here knows what happens after our trucks leave the warehouse. The room remained frozen until Elias picked up the two pay stubs once again. They looked impossibly small against the polished walnut conference table, yet for the first time in years they outweighed every report surrounding them. As the executives slowly gathered their papers in uneasy silence, Graham stayed seated. He watched Elias leave the room carrying nothing except those two folded pieces of paper, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he realized the company's most profitable quarter might also become the beginning of its most expensive decision. The files began arriving before noon, not in neat stacks but in rolling carts pushed by assistants who looked increasingly confused with every trip they made into the executive suite. Vendor contracts, payroll summaries, attendance policies, shift schedules, productivity bonuses, temporary labor agreements. Elias watched the mountain of binders grow until it covered nearly half the conference table. By lunchtime, the sunlight no longer reached the far end of the room. Graham stood beside the doorway with folded arms. This information has never been reviewed together because it was never intended to be reviewed together, he said. Elias opened the first binder without looking up. Maybe that is the problem. For the next 3 hours, he stopped reading summaries and started reading individual records. Employee number after employee number blurred together until one pattern refused to disappear. Most subcontracted workers average between 58 and 74 hours every week. Hundreds held secondary jobs. Overtime disappeared whenever separate contractors split the same person's schedule across multiple payroll systems. Every arrangement complied with the letter of the law. Together, they quietly defeated its purpose. A legal strategy had become an invisible trap. Elias reached another familiar contractor identification number. Meridian Facility Services. He remembered signing the acquisition proposal himself. The presentation had praised flexibility, efficiency, and scalable labor. Nobody had mentioned that flexibility often belonged only to the employer. The workers carried the uncertainty home. His assistant knocked softly before entering. The regional warehouse manager is here. Send him in. A stocky man named Carl Benson stepped inside, visibly nervous beneath his pressed uniform shirt. He had managed Carter's largest distribution center for almost 15 years. Elias invited him to sit. Tell me about staffing. Carl answered carefully. Direct employees are stable. Contractors fill the gaps. Why so many gaps? Carl hesitated. Demand changes every week. Elias slid several attendance reports across the table. Explain these. Carl studied the pages. Perfect attendance incentives. Or punishment for getting sick. Carl lowered his eyes. Officially, they are incentives. Elias picked up another report. Why are so many shifts canceled less than 12 hours before they begin? Forecast adjustments. How often? Carl remained silent. Elias answered from the report instead. Nearly 1,000 times last month. Carl rubbed the back of his neck. People complain. They cannot arrange childcare. Some stop showing up. Others pick up second jobs because they cannot predict their income. Elias leaned back slowly. Did anyone report this? Carl gave a weary smile that carried years of frustration. Every manager reports numbers. Few report consequences. Before Elias could respond, another document caught his attention. It listed employee badge activity across multiple facilities. One name appeared twice. Maya Brooks. Hospital housekeeping from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Warehouse sanitation from 4 in the afternoon until 11 at night. Commute time between both jobs averaged 53 minutes. Average sleep recorded through voluntary wellness surveys, 5 hours and 11 minutes. Elias stared at the page. Someone had measured everything except whether such a life could actually be lived. Who designed this scheduling software? He asked quietly. Graham answered from behind him. Our analytics division. It increased labor efficiency by 14%. Elias closed the folder. It optimized spreadsheets. Graham did not respond. Carl cleared his throat. There is something else you should know. He reached into his own folder and placed a handwritten notebook on the table. The pages were filled with names, dates, and short comments. Childcare emergency. Missed insulin appointment. Slept in break room. Car broke down after double shift. Could not afford repair. Elias looked up. "What is this?" Carl answered almost apologetically. "Things the reports do not ask us to track." The room fell silent. Outside the glass wall, executives hurried between meetings carrying coffee and laptops, unaware that an entirely different picture of the company had begun taking shape behind one closed door. Elias turned another page. Every line belonged to a different employee. Every story sounded strangely familiar. None of them asked for sympathy. They simply described what survival looked like after the workday ended. He slowly closed the notebook and rested his hand on its worn cover. The two pay stubs from the bus had opened one door. This notebook opened another. Maya Brooks had never been the exception. She had simply been the first face attached to a truth that hundreds of people had quietly carried every single day. And somewhere inside the growing stack of documents waiting to be reviewed, Elias realized he was no longer investigating a payroll problem. He was uncovering a business model built on sacrifices that nobody in the boardroom had ever been forced to witness. 3 days later, Elias left the headquarters before sunrise without notifying his executive assistant, without a security detail, and without the black SUV that usually followed him through the city. He borrowed an old pickup truck from the company's vehicle pool, traded his tailored overcoat for a plain navy work jacket, and clipped a temporary visitor badge onto his shirt. If people recognized the billionaire behind Carter Logistics, the truth would hide itself again. He wanted the truth before it had time to put on a clean uniform. The first stop was the distribution center where Maya worked her evening shift. Forklifts hummed through endless aisles while conveyor belts carried thousands of packages beneath bright industrial lights. Managers tracked numbers from glass offices overlooking the warehouse floor. Workers tracked the clock mounted high above the loading docks. Elias walked beside Carl Benson, saying very little. Every few minutes another employee glanced at the schedule board with quiet concern. Some smiled with relief after finding enough hours to cover another week. Others lowered their heads after discovering an entire shift had disappeared overnight. No one complained loudly. They simply adjusted, recalculated, and kept moving. Carl stopped beside a break room bulletin board covered with handwritten notes. Babysitter needed. Carpool available. Anyone willing to trade Saturday night? Looking for affordable asthma medication. Elias read every note. They looked less like workplace announcements and more like people building a safety net the company had never provided. At noon, he visited a childcare center less than 2 miles from the warehouse. Most of the children there belonged to warehouse workers, hospital cleaners, grocery clerks, and delivery drivers. The director recognized Carl immediately. "Several parents called again this morning," she said. "Schedules changed after midnight. We cannot keep rearranging classrooms every day." She opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of forms marked overdue. "These families are good people. They just cannot predict what next week looks like." Elias noticed one familiar name. Noah Brooks. Pickup authorization listed 3 different neighbors because Maya could rarely guarantee she would arrive on time herself. The director smiled gently when she saw him looking. "His mother never forgets him," she said. "She is simply trying to be in 2 places at once." That sentence stayed with Elias long after they left. Later that afternoon, they drove to the small hospital where Maya cleaned patient rooms before crossing the city for her second job. The housekeeping supervisor spoke warmly about her. "She volunteers to help everyone. If another employee has an emergency, Maya covers the shift whenever she can." Elias frowned. "Even though she already works nights?" The supervisor nodded. "She says everybody is carrying something heavy. Sometimes the kindest person in the room is the one carrying the most." As they walked back through the parking lot, Elias noticed Maya emerging from the employee entrance with her lunch packed inside the same faded container Mrs. Alvarez had handed her days earlier. She sat alone on a weathered bench beneath a maple tree, opened the container, and quietly divided the remaining macaroni into 2 portions. She wrapped half again before placing it carefully inside Noah's dinosaur backpack. Then she drank water from a refill station instead of buying coffee from the vending machine only a few feet away. There was no audience, no performance, just another small decision made so her son could have 1 extra meal after school. Elias looked away before she noticed him. For the first time in years, he felt embarrassed by how many business lunches he had left half finished. On the drive back downtown, Carl finally broke the silence. "You asked me why managers never reported the consequences." He rested both hands on the steering wheel. The truth is, some of us tried. He handed Elias a sealed envelope that had yellowed slightly around the edges. That was written almost 2 years ago. Elias opened it carefully. Inside was a memo addressed to senior leadership warning that unpredictable scheduling and fragmented contractor pay were forcing employees into unsustainable lives. At the bottom of the final page appeared a single handwritten note in blue ink. No action required. Filed for future review. The signature beneath it belonged to an executive who had retired 6 months earlier. Elias folded the letter slowly. The problem had not gone unnoticed. Someone had simply decided it was less expensive to ignore. As the skyline came back into view, the city looked different than it had only a few days before. He had boarded a bus believing he was leading a successful company. Now he understood he had inherited a silence that many people had tried to break long before Maya Brooks unknowingly carried 2 wrinkled pay stubs onto the last bus home. And somewhere inside Carter Logistics, someone had worked very hard to make sure those voices never reached the boardroom. The emergency board meeting began at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, but the tension had settled into the room long before the first director arrived. News traveled quickly inside companies of that size, and rumors traveled even faster. Executives whispered outside the conference room. Assistants avoided eye contact. Graham Whitmore sat perfectly still at the far end of the polished table with a folder marked confidential resting neatly beside his laptop. Elias entered carrying no presentation, only the worn notebook Carl Benson had trusted him with, and the same 2 pay stubs that had quietly changed the direction of his thinking. The board chair smiled politely. "We understand you requested an unscheduled discussion regarding labor strategy." Elias nodded once. "Not strategy. Reality." The lights dimmed as the first slide appeared. It was not a financial forecast. It was a photograph of an empty break room with handwritten notes covering the bulletin board. "Need childcare Friday. Anyone driving east after midnight. Selling microwave for rent money." The directors exchanged puzzled looks. Graham spoke first. "I fail to see how anonymous notes relate to shareholder value." Elias calmly changed the slide. "Attendance records. Payroll summaries. Shift cancellations. Contractor maps. Childcare availability. Employee turnover." Every document connected to another until a web of relationships covered the screen. "These are not separate problems," Elias said quietly. "They are one system producing the same outcome." One director leaned forward. "Our legal exposure?" "Minimal," Graham answered immediately. "Every contract complies with existing regulations." Elias looked toward him. "Legally compliant does not mean operationally sustainable." Graham opened his folder. "If we restructure contractor compensation and scheduling, initial projections estimate an increase of $420 million in annual labor costs." A murmur spread across the room. Another director frowned. "That would reduce earnings significantly." Graham continued. "Institutional investors will react immediately. Expansion projects may be delayed. Credit agencies will notice. Competitors will benefit." Elias listened without interrupting. Every number was accurate. Every warning sounded reasonable. That was precisely what made the decision so difficult. The board chair folded his hands. "Do you have evidence these changes are necessary rather than simply desirable?" Elias placed Carl's notebook in the center of the table. "Read any page." No one moved. Finally, an older director opened the notebook at random. His expression slowly changed as he read a single paragraph written in hurried handwriting. "Missed cancer screening because shift changed overnight. Could not reschedule for 3 months." He turned another page. "Daughter sleeping in car during double shift because after-school program closed early." Another page. "Employee fainted from exhaustion after accepting 3rd consecutive emergency assignment." The room grew noticeably quieter. Graham broke the silence. "Individual stories cannot become corporate policy." Before Elias could answer, the conference room door opened unexpectedly. His executive assistant stepped inside, looking unusually uneasy. "I am sorry to interrupt, but there is someone downstairs refusing to leave until management speaks with them." Graham sighed impatiently. "Security can handle it." The assistant hesitated. "It is not one person anymore." Elias walked to the window overlooking the plaza below. Nearly 100 workers stood peacefully outside the headquarters entrance holding lunchboxes, work boots, backpacks, and handwritten signs. There were no angry chants. No shouting. Most simply stood together in silence before beginning another workday. Some still wore hospital uniforms. Others warehouse jackets. Delivery drivers leaned against their vans. Janitors stood beside mechanics. One little boy held a poster almost as tall as he was. In uneven block letters it read, "We work hard. We want to see our moms." Elias recognized the blue dinosaur backpack resting against the child's legs. Noah Brooks stood beside Maya, holding her hand while she looked uncertain about being there at all. She was not leading a protest. She looked as surprised by the growing crowd as everyone inside the building. Workers kept arriving because someone had shared the old memo Carl had written years before. For the first time, they realized they had never been struggling alone. The board members slowly joined Elias at the window. No presentation slide could compete with what they were seeing below. Graham stared in silence before speaking almost to himself. "How did this happen?" Elias answered without taking his eyes off the crowd. "It did not happen today." His voice remained calm. "Today is simply the first day we finally noticed." At that exact moment, Maya looked up toward the glass tower without knowing who stood behind it. She gently adjusted Noah's backpack before helping an elderly maintenance worker straighten a sign that had begun folding in the wind. That small act carried more weight than every financial projection discussed that morning. For the first time since founding Carter Logistics, Elias understood that the greatest risk facing the company was no longer measured in dollars. It was measured in trust, and once trust quietly walked out the front door, no balance sheet in the world could bring it back unchanged. The silence outside the headquarters lasted less than an hour before television vans began parking along the curb. Reporters noticed something unusual almost immediately. No one was shouting. No one was blocking entrances. Warehouse workers stood beside hospital cleaners, delivery drivers beside cafeteria employees. Some held homemade signs. Others simply held their lunch bags because they still intended to report for work. The image spread across local news faster than anyone inside the building expected. Graham watched the broadcast from the executive lounge with growing concern. "This becomes a public relations crisis by noon," he warned. "It becomes something much larger if we mishandle it." Elias answered without taking his eyes off the screen. "It already became something larger years ago." 30 minutes later, the board reconvened. This time the atmosphere had changed completely. Phones vibrated constantly with messages from investors requesting explanations. Market analysts questioned why employees connected to one of the country's most profitable logistics companies were gathering peacefully outside corporate headquarters. The stock price dipped before the opening bell. Graham projected a new financial model across the wall. "If we implement the reforms you requested, earnings will decline immediately. Expansion into 3 new regional markets will be suspended. Executive compensation packages will require restructuring. Several institutional investors may withdraw." One director removed his glasses slowly. "How severe?" Graham did not hesitate. "Worst case, we lose almost $8 billion in market value within the first year." The numbers settled over the room like heavy rain. Elias understood exactly what it meant. Years of growth could disappear because of one decision. Graham looked directly at him. "You built this company from one warehouse into a national network. Do not destroy it trying to fix something the market never asked you to fix." Before Elias could answer, his assistant quietly entered again. "Sir, there is someone asking to speak with whoever is in charge." Graham sighed impatiently. "Tell security no unscheduled visitors." "She already refused media interviews," the assistant replied. "She said she only wants 5 minutes." Elias recognized the name before the assistant finished speaking. Maya Brooks entered the conference room wearing the same hospital uniform she had come to work in that morning. She looked uncomfortable beneath the attention of 12 board members and a wall of city skyline. Noah waited outside with Mrs. Alvarez because children were not allowed beyond the reception area. Maya clasped her hands together, then looked toward Elias without recognizing him as the man from the bus. "I am sorry if people think I organized this," she began softly. "I did not." Her voice remained steady despite the room surrounding her. "Someone shared an old letter online. People started talking. They asked me to come because my pay stubs were in the picture." One director interrupted. "Are you representing the workers?" Maya shook her head immediately. "No, sir. I am only speaking for myself." She hesitated before continuing. "But I think my story sounds familiar because it is not only mine." The room fell quiet again. Maya reached into her worn bag and placed Noah's math worksheet on the conference table beside the pay stubs Elias had kept. My son brought this home last week. She smiled faintly at the crooked red check marks. He keeps asking why I am never there when he finishes his homework. I keep telling him I am working so we can build a better future. She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes one by one. The truth is, I do not need anyone to rescue me. I do not need gifts. I just need my work to be enough. No one spoke. Maya continued in the same calm voice. Every person outside your building believes in working hard. That is why they are here instead of staying home. We are not asking for easy lives. We are asking for lives where doing everything right is finally enough. Elias felt the words settle deeper than any financial projection Graham had presented that morning. It was not anger that filled the room. It was dignity. Maya thanked everyone for listening, gathered Noah's worksheet, and quietly turned toward the door. Then she stopped. Without realizing who Elias truly was, she looked back and said one final sentence. If the people making the decisions never meet the people living with them, then both sides lose something they cannot measure. The door closed gently behind her. No applause followed. No dramatic speeches broke the silence. Graham stared at the empty doorway before looking toward the board. Several directors lowered their eyes. Others quietly closed the financial reports still lying open in front of them. For the first time since the meeting had begun, the largest number in the room was no longer $8 billion. It was one simple question that no spreadsheet could answer. What was the true cost of asking thousands of honest people to work harder every year while believing they should expect nothing more than survival in return? The vote lasted less than 4 minutes. The consequences began before anyone stood up from the table. 6 directors supported the reform plan. 5 opposed it. 1 abstained. The motion passed by the narrowest possible margin. No one celebrated. Graham quietly closed his laptop, knowing the headlines would arrive before the market closed. He was right. Within an hour, financial networks described Carter Logistics as a company abandoning disciplined growth in favor of what one analyst dismissed as an expensive social experiment. The stock price dropped throughout the afternoon. Investors demanded emergency calls. Several major funds announced they were reducing their positions. Reporters camped outside headquarters asking whether the chief executive officer had lost focus. Elias accepted every consequence without asking the communications team to soften the message. Instead, he stood before the cameras and spoke for less than 3 minutes. For years we measured efficiency without measuring whether the people creating that efficiency could build stable lives. That responsibility belongs to me. Today we begin correcting it. He answered no further questions. The real work began behind closed doors. Contractor agreements were rewritten from the ground up. Minimum compensation standards became mandatory across every company connected to the Carter Logistics network. Scheduling software could no longer cancel shifts without guaranteed compensation after a defined notice period. Childcare assistance funds were established near the largest distribution centers. Attendance bonuses that quietly punished illness disappeared. Every subcontractor now faced independent audits that evaluated not only productivity, but also scheduling stability, turnover, and employee well-being. Several vendors immediately refused the new conditions and walked away from their contracts. Graham placed the updated projections on Elias's desk 3 days later. We will lose nearly 15% of our distribution capacity before replacements are ready. Elias signed the revised agreements anyway. Then we rebuild. Graham studied him for a long moment. Do you understand what this may cost your position? Elias looked toward the city outside his office. I do now. The following week, the board requested a special leadership review. Rumors spread quickly that several investors wanted a new chief executive officer before the next earnings report. Elias attended the meeting alone. No speeches. No negotiations. When asked whether he wished to delay implementation until market conditions improved, he answered with a single sentence. If families have already waited years, I can no longer ask them to wait for a better quarter. The proposal to suspend the reforms failed by 1 vote. Elias kept his position, but only after voluntarily declining his annual performance bonus and requesting that every dollar be transferred into the newly created Employee Stability Fund. Several senior executives quietly followed his example over the next month. Not because they were ordered to, but because it became difficult to defend privileges they had never questioned before. Maya knew almost nothing about those boardroom battles. Her days still began before sunrise, although something small had started changing. Her evening shifts no longer disappeared without warning. The childcare center called less often because schedules arrived 2 weeks in advance instead of 2 days. One Friday afternoon, she found a letter in her employee mailbox explaining that her hospital cleaning position would become full-time with expanded benefits through a new partnership agreement. She read the page twice before folding it carefully beside the old pay stubs she still carried in her bag. That evening, she arrived at Noah's school 10 minutes before dismissal for the first time in months. Noah spotted her waiting outside the classroom door and froze with surprise before running into her arms. "You came early," he whispered, as though saying it too loudly might make the moment disappear. Maya smiled through eyes that suddenly felt warm. "I told you I would keep trying." On the ride home, she boarded the same bus where everything had quietly begun. She chose a seat near the middle and watched families climb aboard carrying grocery bags, backpacks, and tired smiles. She still did not know the stranger who had returned her pay stubs was the man whose signature had placed his own reputation, fortune, and future at risk. She only knew that somewhere, somehow, work had begun feeling a little more like hope than survival, and for the first time in a very long while, tomorrow no longer felt like a debt she could never quite repay. 1 year later, the last bus still crossed the city just before midnight, its engine carrying nurses, warehouse workers, janitors, restaurant servers, and people whose names rarely appeared in annual reports. The route had not changed. The rain still traced silver lines across the windows whenever storms rolled through downtown. Even the driver looked familiar. Only one thing felt unmistakably different. Fewer passengers boarded with the hollow stare of people who had forgotten what rest felt like. Maya Brooks stepped onto the bus wearing the same quiet smile Noah had started calling her Friday smile, because she no longer worked every evening of every week. Her hospital position had become her only job. The warehouse contract had ended months earlier after Carter Logistics replaced fragmented staffing with full-time regional teams. She still carried her lunch container, although tonight it held leftovers she planned to share with Noah after his school concert. The dinosaur backpack had disappeared. Noah had outgrown it over the summer, insisting he was too old for dinosaurs now, even though Maya secretly kept it folded inside a closet because some memories deserved a place to rest. She settled into a seat near the middle of the bus and looked out at the passing lights. Across the aisle, 2 young warehouse employees compared next month's schedules. One laughed. "I already booked my daughter's birthday because I actually know I am off that Saturday." The other smiled. Imagine that. Planning life more than a week ahead. Maya listened quietly before turning back toward the window. She did not know either man, but she understood exactly why that conversation mattered. For rows behind her, another passenger quietly observed the city through the rain-speckled glass. Elias Carter wore the same simple hoodie and faded baseball cap he had chosen on the night everything began. No one recognized him. He preferred it that way. The board meetings had become more difficult over the past year. Earnings had recovered more slowly than investors expected. Several executives who opposed the reforms had accepted positions elsewhere. Graham Whitmore had surprised everyone by staying. He still challenged Elias in meetings, but somewhere between the first difficult vote and the first improved employee report, even he had stopped arguing that people belonged only inside spreadsheets. Last quarter, he had personally presented new retention numbers showing lower turnover, stronger productivity, fewer workplace injuries, and improved customer satisfaction. He had ended the presentation with words Elias never expected to hear from him. Stability turned out to be an investment, not an expense. The bus slowed beside Maple and 17th. Maya pressed the stop request button and stood. As she reached for the overhead rail, a folded piece of paper slipped from her coat pocket onto the floor. Elias picked it up before it drifted beneath another seat. For a brief second, the memory returned with perfect clarity. 2 wrinkled pay stubs. 1 exhausted mother. 1 ordinary bus ride. He walked forward and handed her the paper. Maya smiled warmly. "Thank you." She unfolded it without noticing the man who had returned it. It was not a pay stub this time. It was Noah's latest math test. Every answer was correct. Across the top, his teacher had written in bright blue ink, "Outstanding work. Keep reaching higher." Maya laughed softly to herself before carefully placing the paper back inside her bag. Have a good night, Elias said. You too, she replied before stepping onto the sidewalk. Noah waited beneath the streetlight, now taller than the backpack he once carried, and waving both hands the moment he saw her. They walked home side by side, talking about school, music, and whether they should make pancakes on Saturday morning. Their voices faded into the evening as they disappeared around the corner. Elias remained seated until the doors closed again. The driver glanced into the mirror and asked, "You missed your stop?" Elias smiled gently. "No, I was exactly where I needed to be." The bus pulled away, carrying him toward another meeting, another decision, another opportunity to remember what numbers alone could never explain. Somewhere behind him, a mother would be home in time to hear about a perfect math test. Somewhere across the city, thousands of families would eat dinner together because work no longer demanded every waking hour they possessed. None of those changes began with a miracle. They began because one tired woman carried 2 wrinkled pay stubs onto the last bus home, and one man finally chose not to look away. Sometimes the smallest piece of paper does not change a life by itself. Sometimes it changes the person holding the power to change thousands more.